Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from today. My name is Coral Owen. I'm the Professional Development Coordinator for the Military Families Learning Network, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on responsive feeding practices. This learning opportunity is hosted by the Nutrition and Wellness Concentration Area of the Military Families Learning Network. Webinar resources, including the webinar slides, can be found and downloaded via learn.extension.org/events/3068 under the Event Materials section at the bottom of that page. And that link is available for you in the Important Info pod to the lower right-hand corner of this page. Additionally, if you have need of tech support during today's webinar, please don't hesitate to email us at milfamln@gmail.com. That address is also located in the Important Info pod to the lower right of your screen. The Military Family Network is part of a DoD-USDA partnership for military families, connecting military family service providers and cooperative extension professionals to research and to each other through engaging online learning opportunities. You can explore more about our communities and resources at militaryfamilies.extension.org. I'd also like to let you know that you can join our MFLN webinar and email list to receive our monthly programming update by clicking on the link in the lower right of this slide. Finally, the MFLN is active on Facebook and Twitter, and we host an archive of our professional development sessions on YouTube. Note that many of these are still eligible for CPEU or CEC credit, so do check these out. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn things over to Kristen DiFilippo, who is an MS and RDN and the Professional Development Coordinator for the Nutrition and Wellness team. Thank you, Kristen.
Thanks, Coral. Good morning, everyone. As Coral said, my name is Kristen DiFilippo. I am the Professional Development Coordinator for the Military Families Learning Network Nutrition and Wellness Concentration Area. It is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Susan Johnson, to you all. Dr. Johnson is a tenured professor of pediatrics and associate director of the Leadership for Innovation Team Science program at the University of Colorado. Dr. Johnson is an internationally recognized expert in early childhood nutrition, specifically the impact of the environment on the development of children's eating behaviors and growth. She has written more than 100 refereed journal articles, proceedings, and chapters, and is a widely sought-after speaker both nationally and worldwide. The Children's Eating Laboratory, under her direction, currently focuses their investigations on the impacts of family eating and child feeding strategies on young children's eating behavior and growth. And we are very excited to have her speak to us today. Now, before I turn things over to Dr. Johnson, I'm going to ask you, the audience, to complete a very quick poll for us. You'll notice a gray box pop up on your screen. If you could please click on your affiliation, keep it in mind that you might need to scroll down the screen a bit to find your correct category. And it looks like we have quite a few of you from Health and Human Services, another set of numbers from Extension and University settings, and then quite a few of you from other settings. It's good to see we have a wide variety of people attending with us today. Thank you for taking the time to complete our poll. As a final reminder, please notice you can download the slides directly to your computer from this webinar by clicking on the file in the box at the bottom right-hand corner. Also, you can type your comments and questions into the chat pod. I will now turn it over to Dr. Johnson to begin our presentation.
Good morning, everyone. I am really excited to be here, and I'm seeing these numbers climb on the participants for the webinar, and I note from the chat box that we have people here from coast to coast, and that's really exciting. Thanks so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you about a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, and that is the topic of responsive feeding. And part of what I want to talk about today includes not only why responsive feeding is important, but how to recognize it when you see it. because it's a concept that we often talk about, but I'm not sure that we give really practical information about how you can develop it for yourself with your child and how you can encourage your clients to pursue the practice of responsive feeding. In all, we'll cover what are 4 fundamental principles of responsive feeding and understand specific attributes and behaviors so that you can, again, recognize it when you see it and then apply this information and give ways to think about using this with other families that you encounter. First, I want to step back just a little bit from the topic of responsive feeding and put it in an overall framework that talks about recommendations that we make for how to feed children well. And the thing that I want you to really think about from this particular slide is that there are at least 3 different components that come into play when we think about developing guidelines for feeding children. One is that the topic area that I think we're all most familiar and comfortable with, and that's thinking about the nutrient requirements and where those are sourced from. But it's also important to think about what the child's developmental readiness is or their capability. And this is an area that sometimes we don't pay as much attention to as we could. It's understanding things like what are the signals and motor milestones associated with feeding as opposed to the other kind of motor milestones that we expect to see from children, and when do we expect to see them. So the nutrients in combination with the child's readiness also have an interplay with the kind of feeding practices that help children best develop their eating skills and that set the stage for the best eating experience for the child. One of the resources that I really like to pay attention to when I'm thinking about this is the Pediatric Nutrition Handbook from the American Academy of Pediatrics. And the reason why I bring in this particular resource is that I think from a standpoint of combining children's development with their nutrition needs, that the AAP is an example of a really good partner for all of us in the area of nutrition, in that they really think about children's health and growth from a developmental standpoint. And this particular resource you can see started as early as 1979 and has changed over the years to include and encompass different topics. So in 1979, it mostly focused on developmental maturity. But over time, it came to include healthy growth. It included attention to internal signals of hunger and satiety. It looked at specifically recommendations for complementary feeding. It looked and included information related to repeated exposures to novel foods to help children learn to accept them. It transitioned to looking from adequate nutrition for children as only being about calories to looking at overall dietary quality in the latest edition. But here's the important piece that relates to today's topic specifically, and that is it also included information related to responsive feeding. I think it provides a nice framework for all of us to work together to include those 3 areas that I talked about earlier, and that is the nutrient requirements along with the child's readiness and bringing in that piece about how caregiver feeding practices and styles can have an impact on children's eating and eating habits through the lifetime, through the life course. So just a few words more on what developmental readiness is and why it's important for eating and feeding is because developmental readiness really focuses on that overarching capacity to help children establish the healthiest food habits. It, again, includes that more well-rounded eating experience that goes beyond the food and incorporates the eating environment It incorporates how we go about feeding children, so the feeding practices, but it also includes the child in a way that facilitates responsive feeding, and that's because it really attends to what the child's capabilities are in the moment and seeks to match our feeding strategies and practices to the child's developmental readiness and capability. So what are some examples of developmental milestones that are related to feeding? I think that if you ask most any parent, they would be able to tell you things about milestones related to crawling and walking, for example. That, they expect that every child is going to be able to roll over somewhere around 5 months of age or 6 months of age, that they might begin to crawl somewhere around 9 months of age, and we expect to see children taking first steps somewhere around 12 months of age, plus or minus, depending on the child. Well, what we don't as often talk about is that there are feeding milestones as well that come in at pretty predictable times. What you see on this slide is an example of some of the feeding milestones that are already in place by birth, but that are essential for development of successful feeding on the part of the child. Let's take a look first over here at the rooting reflex. The rooting reflex is best seen when the cheek of the infant is touched and children respond by turning in the direction of that touch on the cheek. And oftentimes that's associated also with some mouthing that happens. And the rooting reflex, at least if you think about it from what's the purpose of this reflex, is to help the child locate the nipple so that they get to the source of the food. The suckling reflex is also present actually before birth. It begins to appear somewhere in the second trimester of pregnancy. And again, it's necessary for the child to take in the source of nutrition that they will need at birth, and that is milk in whatever format that it comes in. Here's one that we don't talk as often about, and that's the extrusor reflex. The extrusor reflex refers to that action, that behavior that you see infants do, especially newborns, when you touch the tip of their tongue. What they tend to do is stick the tongue out at you, and you can see that this infant has its tongue sticking out. The extrusor reflex is necessary and important to help the child get a good latch on the nipple. If their tongue were up at the roof of their mouth or still in the mouth, it would be harder for the infant to get a really good secure latch, and they would have a much more inefficient intake of milk, whether from the breast or from the bottle. What's interesting about the extrusor reflex is that it's there at birth, but it actually disappears somewhere around 4 to 6 months of age, which coincidentally is about the time that we suggest beginning the intake of complementary foods. So its appearance at birth facilitates good nutrition, and its disappearance somewhere around 4 to 6 months helps in the transition to the intake of solid foods. What are some other signals that are related to complementary feeding, and that it might be a good time to think about introducing solid foods? Well, one that is especially important is head and neck control. The infant has to be able to hold its head up. We often think about as nutrition and food being the most important part for children's existence and for sustaining healthy growth and development. Actually, there's one that comes before that, and that's being able to breathe. Head and neck control are really important for protecting the airway. Respiration comes in front of feeding. You have to be able to breathe to be able to continue eating. And so that's why the focus on head and neck control before complementary feeding, because you want to protect the airway. Other developmental milestones that come in about the time of beginning complementary foods include the, um, the palmar grasp. And what you see here is that the palmar grasp really refers to that whole hand grasp. Infants don't come into the world being able to do this with control or do it volitionally. This really doesn't begin to appear until about 6 months of age. The pincer grasp, which is the one next door, is a fine motor grasp that is really between the thumb and the index finger. And it is a fine motor grasp that begins to appear somewhere around 9 months of age. It might be a month before, it might be a few months afterwards. And it allows the child to be able to pick up small objects. And if you put that into the feeding context, it allows them to be able to pick up a piece of food and orient it towards the mouth. And what you can see from this particular picture over here is that it's an inefficient process to begin with. That just because they have the palmar grasp and the pincer grasp and the ability to pick up either implements that allow them to self-feed or the pieces of food themselves, that they have to become better at it with practice. And part of what happens during that period of the introduction of complementary foods is giving them opportunities to learn to get better at those motor milestones and those motor activities that will allow them to begin self-feeding. So just to put this in a package together about express signals of developmental readiness for the introduction of complementary foods, things that you see infants do is to begin to pick up objects, put them in their mouths, and begin to mouth them. They begin to become more efficient at bringing their hand to their mouth. They have the ability to take the food into their mouth instead of expelling it, and that relates to the disappearance of the extrusor reflex that I talked about earlier. And they have an interest in self-feeding. They pick up finger foods while the caregiver is using a spoon because they have an interest in learning how to do this for themselves. Some people, and I think this is a great idea, promote having the infant hold one spoon while the caregiver is offering it with another to facilitate that transition from the caregiver being in charge of getting the food to the infant being able to, over a period of time, be able to take on this activity to themselves, for themselves. You know, what I've really tried to highlight here in terms of developmental readiness is that transition that happens from birth through at least the first 12 months of age, where there are milestones that indicate to us behaviorally that the infant is ready to make that transition to complementary foods, so something other than milk or formula, and that also they give us signals about their readiness to begin being able to do this for themselves. So what are some of the critical points where we as caregivers find developmental readiness and its principles as challenging? You know, it's great to have these high-flown principles about when children should be able to do certain things and allowing them to do them, but the truth is that there are other environmental or familial circumstances that really result in this being challenging. So for example, exclusive breastfeeding for the first 5 to 6 months turns out to be really challenging for a number of mothers, and there are many reasons why that occurs. I invite you to go to your chat box and give some of your experiences about the challenges of exclusive breastfeeding for the first 5 to 6 months. That transition to pureed table foods is also a point where things are very challenged. How do you know that your infant is ready? How do you give that information to others that you are working with to help them recognize those signals? Yes, I see a response in the chat box that say returning to work while you're breastfeeding does promote a challenge for being able to continue exclusive breastfeeding. It depends on what kind of job you have. It depends on what kind of support your work site gives to you to being able to continue pumping if you're returning to work. Sometimes you are just too exhausted, as I see here, and you need to stop breastfeeding because you've hit the wall and you can't do it anymore. Part of what I'm trying to spur here is a recognition that I've come to recognize just lately, that we write our feeding recommendations as if they are black and white. It's good to exclusively breastfeed for the first 5 to 6 months, and somehow it's not so good if you can't do that. When the truth is it would seem to me that there's some room in between, and there's some room to support mothers to do the best that they can, and also, as I see in the chat box, to support our working environments to step up and help mothers do the very best that they can. Transitions related to self-feeding, and I again invite you to share your comments with others about issues or things that make it difficult to allow the very young child to self-feed. Sometimes there are conditions like allergies that make this a little harder to do, but there's also a time issue. It takes longer to promote self-feeding for the very young infant. It is oftentimes messier to promote self-feeding for the younger child. And so being afraid that babies will choke, that's related to lots of different things. The preparation of what you're offering them, it also turns out that that's related to a developmental milestone, that babies don't come with a fully formed gag reflex. I'm wondering if anybody out there has information about when the when the swallowing and gagging combination is fully formed for the child. When is that fully developed? I'd love to see what people's ideas about when that ability to take things into the mouth, to move them around the mouth to be processed, and to swallow that without leading to gagging is fully in place for the child. Does anybody have any answers about that? I'm not seeing anybody jump in yet, so I'll just go ahead and give you some information. I have seen the numbers about when that is fully in place range from about 4 years of age to 8 years of age. It takes a long time for that to be fully developed and a lot of practice with eating and feeding. So the fact that kids gag and choke is a fact of life. It's frightening for caregivers, and it does challenge how we think about feeding our children. The drinking from the cup is another place where there are lots and lots of challenges. Sippy cups are in the eye of the beholder. They're either the best thing that ever happened, and they might make your life so much easier, and there's so many things that you can give to your child in the sippy cup, or from a developmentalist perspective, they're challenging because while they make it a lot cleaner and a lot tidier, and perhaps they do make it easier for a child to transition to a cup that has a lid on it, they also promote sucking longer than somebody who is thinking oral developmental than perhaps we would like them to. In drinking from a cup that has a lip on it is a different skill than sipping and sucking from a sippy cup. So from a developmentalist perspective, they're not as great as they are from a mom's perspective of how fast and tidy it makes that transition. So part of what I'm trying to creep into the conversation here is there are many, many different ways to view how and why we feed our children the way that we do. And yes, as I see in the comments, when you have a 4, you don't have time to always let the child, a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, you don't always have time to meet the highest goal. And that brings us back to what is our goal in feeding children, and perhaps dichotomizing it, not dichotomizing it anymore into the here's the good and here's the not so good, but rather striking a middle ground of there are days when I hit the ideal and there are days when I don't. And what is the best that I can do on a given day, and supporting each of us to be able to achieve that goal. Thank you for all of your comments in that. I think we've hit some of these chat points along the way already, but again, I'm wondering, instead of thinking about from your personal perspective, which I've liked seeing those comments, what are the kinds of things that your clients say about these transitions, specifically about maintaining breastfeeding as long as you can, about concerns they have about when and what to offer in terms of complementary foods? What are some of the challenges that they bring to you about self-feeding, and how do you address those? What kinds of advice do you give to them, and how do you help them move along in that transition to helping children learn to do the best that they can for themselves in a way that works not only for the child but also works for the caregiver? So I think people will be very, very interested to see the kinds of offerings that you give to clients. Picky eaters and unwillingness to try new foods. There's a particular challenge. And yes, I agree with you that the doctor's office is not always the place where you get the most consistent information. And I actually think that from a professional standpoint, that's an opportunity for us to help both pediatricians and family practice docs, as well as nurse practitioners, with giving them developmentally appropriate information that can support their patients and their families in the way that we would like to help do that for them, because they don't always have the answers. All right, now I'm going to actually transition into talking a bit more about responsive feeding. What I wanted to do was give you a context and a background for children's eating during that infancy through toddler stage. And now let's talk a bit about how our different feeding practices can also have an impact on children's learning about eating, the the things that they learn from us that we want them to learn, and the things that they end up doing that we're not so crazy about. Responsive feeding as a topic was actually developed in the context of malnutrition, what we classically think of as international malnutrition. And it comes from an intervention science that was dedicated to helping children and caregivers in developing countries improve children's nutrition, their growth, helping caregivers improve their feeding strategies, all with the goal of improving nutrition status and decreasing morbidity and mortality associated with poor development. So let's think just a moment about how parent beliefs and expectations relate to not what they offer their children, but how they offer foods to their children. I'm going to break this up into two different paradigms. It's not to say that this is not a spectrum. It's just a little easier to communicate as a dichotomy. Responsive feeding works on the principle that we pay attention to children's cues of hunger and satiety, but also developmental readiness, those things that we were talking about earlier, and it is very, very child-centered. The child leads, and we respond. That is not to say that responsive feeding equals permissive feeding. It doesn't mean that the child rules. It means that we look to the child for indications of what they're ready for, when they're ready for, and it lines up nicely, actually, with Ellen Satter's principles of feeding, in that adults remain responsible for what is offered and the situation and structure in when it is offered, and the children are responsible for how much they consume and whether they consume a given food. So it aligns nicely with that mantra that we've adopted for quite some time. Goal-driven feeding, on the other hand, is related to needing to get the child to eat. And, I think needing to get your child to eat can happen for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's about the time in the day that you have to get the job done. Sometimes it's about competing demands where you have a list of other things to get done, and amongst that list is needing to get the child to eat. It is goal-driven feeding is more adult-centered and about what the adult needs to get done, and it's constrained both by the environment that the family is in and by a number of socioeconomic considerations as well. And so, Barbara, I'm hoping that has aligned nicely what we were talking about earlier with responsive feeding and with the Satter model. And if you have more discussion that you want to promote about that, I'm happy to attend to that as we go along. Responsive parenting. Let's step back from just feeding and think about responsive parenting in general. And here are 4 being responsive that I talked about in the learning objectives. The definition is at least that caregiver behaviors are responsive if they happen in a prompt fashion. The child says, I need this in some way, or displays a behavior that suggests a need, and the caregiver responds promptly. The caregiver is emotionally supportive of what the child's needs are. And again, I want to caution that being supportive does not mean being permissive or indulgent. It means being appropriately attentional and responding. Caregiver behaviors are responsive when they're contingent. It means that it depends on what kind of signal that the child is giving, and that the caregiver behavior aligns with the child's signal, and it changes in context to the child's signal. And caregiver behaviors are responsive if they're developmentally appropriate, that they take into consideration what the child's capacity is, and that means their age as well as their development, and that it makes sure that our responses to them are neither intrusive, doing too much for the child, they're not controlling, that we over control the situation, but that they're also attentive and timely. So now let's drill down just a little bit and talk about how responsive feeding is a sort of subdomain, if you will, of responsive parenting. What makes for responsive feeding? Well, the first thing is that the context in which the child is eating, a mealtime, if you will, is a pleasant context. And, oftentimes we talk about pleasant contexts or pleasant meal times, but trying to operationalize those or make it concrete what makes for a pleasant mealtime is not often something that we have a lot of discussion about. Here are some examples of some earmarks of a pleasant feeding context for a young child. It's where the child is able to be seated comfortably and ideally is facing the caregiver who is interacting with them during feeding. And I want to draw your attention to this photograph in the right-hand corner, the upper right-hand corner, where you see that this mother is facing their child. The child is seated, but what you don't see is a lot of specific equipment. So this brings up questions for us about what's the necessary set of equipment that we need, and then and that is what I would put in the category of have to have versus the other equipment that's nice to have, but you don't have to have it. This mother is clearly facing her child, and they are close together, but they don't have a lot of bells, buttons, and whistles in how they're going about the feeding process. And it makes us sort of think to ourselves, what is it that we have to be able to do this well? And what I'd particularly like you to think about is how do we take that kind of a situation and translate it to families that perhaps we have more contact with in our U.S. environment? And what's the equipment and the setting that we have to make the feeding context pleasant for the young child? Pleasant feeding also includes when we communicate our expectations clearly with the child, and when the food is of adequate quality and sufficiently tasty. It's prepared in a way that's developmentally appropriate for the age of the child, and it also comes upon a predictable schedule. Now, again, what's a predictable schedule? I want to make sure that no one misinterprets those words to think that I am meaning that meal times are all scheduled and it's not child-driven in terms of internal cues of hunger and satiety. Predictability is important, especially for very young children. Predictability and consistency. It's the bedrock of helping them learn to be able to develop healthy eating habits. It's sort of the platform upon which everything else rests. But it's not minute to minute or a time on the clock. It means that the child comes to know that there is some kind of routine and that they depend upon that routine to help them learn other things. Responsive feeding beyond the pleasant feeding context also includes encouraging and attending to the child's hunger and satiety signals, their hunger and fullness signals. So we pay attention when the child gets hungry, and to the extent that we can, we feed them in that moment, but we also pay attention to the cues that they give us that they've had enough rather than necessarily attending to how much they've eaten or how much is left in the portion to determine whether or not we stop making that food available. And then getting back to our big four, it's our response is prompt, it's supportive, it's contingent, and it's developmentally appropriate. I see a really great question in the chat box, and that is, how long should a child be expected to sit for? And what are the strategies to help a child sit at meal times? And I'm curious to know what others think about that. But I think, again, it's something that relates to the age of the child. The child who is the very young child, the toddler, is probably going to sit for as long as you are actively feeding them. One thing that's important to remember is that not all people, and certainly not all babies, eat at the same speed. And while one child may take 5 minutes to eat their food, there's another child that may take 20 to do that. So when they're in that very young phase, part of it is about how capable they are in terms of the oral motor aspects of feeding. How hungry they are determines the speed at which they will feed and eat. And then from a temperament standpoint, how long they're willing to sit still is another individual attribute of the child. Once they become older, once they're at the 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old stage, I think that you can expect them to be able to sit longer, but that it's a process that builds slowly. And I'm curious to know what others think about what that number should be. I sometimes hesitate to give that number. I think what you see out there in the guidance is that children should be expected and encouraged to be able to sit for a period of up to 15 minutes, but that doesn't mean that that whole 15 minutes will be spent in eating. What are some of the strategies that you think of that engage children while at the table, but that are not necessarily about getting them to eat the whole time that they're at the table? I'm curious to know what other people out there amongst our participants think about ways to help children learn to sit at the table a bit longer. And so, and while we're having some chatting and conversation about ways to help children um, begin to sit at the table longer, I also would like for you to think about details that make an environment pleasant. I think oftentimes it's easier to think about what makes them unpleasant. Earlier in the chat room, I saw someone talking about distractions. What kind of distractions happen during feeding time and meal time that can make it harder to feed children? I think noise is one of the ones that makes it harder. I think that having many other things, the television is a major distraction. Other children can work for you or they can work against you. You know, I like to think about other children as being a domino effect, but sometimes it's for the good and sometimes it's difficult. One child who says they don't like something or that is particularly needy at an eating occasion can make it harder for the other children at the table. On the other hand, a child who models good eating can engage their younger sibling in learning how to eat a bigger variety of things. So it can oftentimes go both ways. Using conversation cards is a great way to make talking happen more easily. I don't know about you, but I've recently come to understand that just because you're a parent doesn't mean that you come equipped with a manual that tells you everything that you're supposed to know about how to work with your young child. And that includes what kinds of conversations you can expect to have with a very young child. I think a great resource for those kind of conversations includes engaging childcare staff and providers. They are incredibly good oftentimes at engaging young children at mealtime conversations that are not all about the food, but that bring children in to talk about a wide variety of topics. And I think that's actually a really useful and appropriate strategy to engage children to be able to sit at the table longer. uh, Parents and other caregivers modeling that behavior also is important. Parents aren't the only one who get up and down from the table numerous times. I think that that can be distracting for children, but making sure to return and do most of their eating while their children are at the table is a good goal to have. So talk about the kind of food that you're eating, where it comes from, where it grows, other conditions that you, other things related to the food and the growing, and other places they might have seen such food or encountered such foods are all great ways to get a conversation rolling. I'm going to point out, though, that the conversation that you have with children at meal times doesn't have to be all about food and eating. Should include some of that, but it can be about the rest of the parts of your day. Really recently, we have conducted some interviews and some focus groups with families in our state of Colorado to find out what happens for them at mealtime and what their value is for mealtime. And it turns out that it goes beyond the food, that it's a really important time of day for them to catch up and to find out about the things that they oftentimes miss in their children's day. So there are many, many topics that we can talk about at mealtime that reinforce good eating habits, but also lead to other important parts of family life. So caregiver actions that are associated with responsive feeding. In breastfeeding, I think we're all pretty aware of the hunger and satiety cues that we can pick up from our infants, um, related to whether they need to eat some more or whether they're losing interest. Responding also, though, to the child signals related to an interest in increasing variety, increasing texture, increasing their tastes. And you'll notice I've chosen the word taste and not consumption. You know, oftentimes with our really young children, we think about getting them to eat some new food. And I think that maybe sometimes we miss a step. And that step is getting them to taste something new, short of expecting them to eat a big quantity of it or a significant quantity of it. So I encourage you to think about ways of increasing variety and texture, but also increasing taste that falls short of getting all the way to the goal of consuming a big amount. Responsive feeding responds positively to the child's attempts to self-feed. Sometimes um, that's where the child gets to exclusively feed themselves. And then I think another area that we don't necessarily talk a lot about is co-feeding, where the caregiver still maintains some level or some role in helping to feed the child, but that the child gets a spoon in their hand, or they also get to feed themselves along with the caregiver. That might take a little longer, but it builds those skills. It's a dance, and sometimes we miss the child's cues, or the child's cues are confusing. That's another area that I think we don't always talk about. We're very good at saying we should respond to cues of hunger and fullness that are child-driven, but what happens when the child's cues are quite subtle or they're very confusing? Um, it's a learning process, and it's learning on both ends, and I think it's something that we get better at as we go along. I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time because I see that we're closing in on the last part of our conversation here. But I did want to talk to you about a really innovative study that I ran across just recently. It's just out. And it is a randomized control trial. It was just a pilot study, but it looked at the effects of responsive feeding, but it did it via an online learning video called Happier Meals. And what you see is a link to the YouTube video down below if any of you are interested in looking at that, that they look at ways to help caregivers learn about responsive feeding that's not a one-on-one contact with the caregivers. They call it vicarious learning because it's online learning. The caveat is they mostly piloted this in higher education, higher income families, but they had very good principles that they used that supported and underscored responsive feeding. Those included things like focusing on the food environment and trusting children's choices within a healthy food environment. And I think about this like I would stacking the deck in a card game. that the healthier our food choices are within the environments that we have at home, the less conflict that comes with that, because what we're doing is offering children choices between pretty healthy things that exist there rather than having to do the daily battles over the things that we don't want them to eat. They also included points about how one can include children in preparation of the food that they're going to eat, modeling healthy eating, and tips for offering new foods. And what they saw in this pilot study, at least, with online learning with parents, is that responsive feeding knowledge improved and beliefs in responsive feeding increased. And while this falls short of observed behavior in the parents, we're depending on what they're telling us from a self-report questionnaire, I think it's important to say not only did knowledge improve, but that the belief that this would be helpful also improved, and that is a key step in achieving that behavior, is having people actually believe that it can make a difference in children's eating. So take just a moment in the chat room, and I'm really happy to see how active you folks are in that chat room, about thinking about the elements of a healthy home environment, a healthy home food environment specifically. Think about what foods and drinks are included there and what child-oriented foods are included there. And again, this comes actually recently from some work that we've done in surveying home food environments of different families here in Colorado. And sometimes it's about the foods and what's present and what's not present. Sometimes it's about the policies that we have at the family level, and you can call those policies, or you can call those our sort of rules or guidelines that we operate with as a family that support how we go about eating. And it's about feeding strategies that can improve how kids eat and feeding strategies that maybe aren't so supportive or can make things more conflictive and challenging. And the last thing that I really want you to think about is the risks and the consequences of having a food environment that is too restrictive or too perfect. First of all, I think it can be really unrealistic for families because there are many individuals to consider in the family and the home environment. And because a kid doesn't encounter certain things at home doesn't mean that they're going to not encounter them out in the world. So these are all considerations that we have to think about when we're developing that home environment that's related to food and eating. So I think we're gonna end on thinking through what responsive feeding can teach children. I think in its best set of circumstances, responsive feeding can support the child to understand that when they have a need, it will get met. And that is one of the fundamental things that children benefit from learning very early on, that when they need something, there will be somebody there who will respond to that demand. That is an element of trust that children build that helps support healthy eating. Responsive feeding can support children to learn to self-feed, to have new experiences, that eating doesn't have to be a chore, that sometimes at least, again, avoiding that sort of good and not good mentality, that sometimes it can be fun. It's probably not going to be fun all the time, but sometimes we can achieve that. Responsive eating can help them learn to try new foods. It can help them learn to do things for themselves at the pace at which they are ready to learn those things. So it is specific to the child, it's individual, and it's matched. I think an important thing that responsive feeding can teach children is they can ask for help. At what point do they realize they can't do it all by themselves, but they know that if they ask for help, that they will receive it, and they can trust the caregiver to respond. And I'm not sure that those are the outcomes for feeding that we necessarily always pay a lot of attention to. I think we're more often focused on how much did we get them to eat, and that these outcomes, behavioral outcomes, are equally important to the end goal of helping children eat well. Eating's formative. The better those experiences are early on, what we know is that the better those experiences are, the better children end up eating later on, and that things they learn to eat early on track into later childhood. Here's a topic that I've seen come up in the chat room that I want to spend just a moment on. It's that how do you feed the picky eater versus the good eaters? And information that I want to present to you is actually, again, coming from qualitative research that we've conducted with families here in Colorado. And it turns out that mothers describe their young children in two different groups, and that they respond to their children's based on those two different groups. If mothers have good eaters, they talk to us more about responsive feeding. They talk to us about making sure that their child is satisfied, about attending to hunger and satiety cues, about health and growth and nutrition. For the picky eaters, that mom has a different set of concerns. She's most worried about getting her child to eat, and to eat enough to make sure that they are going to grow well. And her primary concern turns out to be getting them to eat something, anything, versus worrying as much about health. I think that one of the things that we can do in our practice is help those mothers of picky eaters focus in on what responsive feeding principles can be, and to see whether turning some of the feeding strategies that they're using because they're so worried into more responsive feeding practices, and determining whether those responsive feeding practices can help their children transition from being quite so picky into being better eaters, so that some of the stress and the worry is gone. Effective ways that we know really reinforce children's food acceptance, the effective ways that we know decrease healthy habits in children, is when we offer foods as reward, when we pressure children to eat more, which is a strategy most often applied and endorsed by mothers of picky eaters. Alternatively, when we're too permissive, when there's not enough structure and routine to eating, we know that that's most often associated with poor variety and especially poor fruit and vegetable consumption by children. And when we cater, when we are too wishy-washy in our expectations for children, that's associated with poor intakes as well. Things that we know work. Positive parenting practices include encouragement and praise, and just with one caveat, and for people to really think quite a lot about, your encouragement might feel like my pressure. That line between encouragement and pressure is often very slim. And to really think through, both for ourselves and with our clients, what the difference between encouraging a child to eat and pressuring them to eat is really, really important. Practices that are child-centered and responsive, that do have expectations of children. What we know in lots of different domains from children is that when you set a goal, many children strive to achieve it. So not being afraid to have a higher expectation of children, modeling the behaviors that we think are appropriate, and learning how to structure and build routines in a way that work for children. Children eat the way they do, partly based on their biology, but they also learn. Mothers want to do the best they can for their children, and they want their children to enjoy eating. Responsive feeding really helps them do that. And the best parenting is responsive to the child's developmental stage as well as the quality of what we offer them. Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed my time with you, and I hope it's been informative for you as well.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for this wonderful webinar and for spending your time with us and offering us your expertise today. It's evident by the very active chat pod that we have all learned a great deal from what you've shared. Nutrition and Wellness is active on social media, and we would love for you to connect with us and continue this conversation on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. The links are being posted in the chat pod now and are also on the current slide. In addition, we would like to invite our MFLN service provider partners such as the Department of Defense, branch services, Guard, and Reserve service providers, and cooperative extension professionals to continue the discussion in our private and moderated LinkedIn group. Please click the link at the bottom of this page to join the group or send us an email. We look forward to hearing from you. And finally, we are offering one continuing education unit for registered dietitians today for the webinar. We are also offering continuing education credit from the Early Intervention Training Program at the University of Illinois. To receive your continuing ed credit or Early Intervention Training Program credit, please click on the link on the screen. You will need to complete a brief survey about today's webinar, and afterwards you will be prompted to input your name and email address, and the CPAU credit will be emailed to you. There will be separate links that you will follow depending on which continuing education credit you are looking for. Also, a recording of today's webinar will be archived within 48 hours to our YouTube channel, which you can access via the Learn page. All of our nutrition and wellness webinars can be viewed and the CPEU credits earned for up to 1 year post-webinar. You can access these webinars by visiting our nutrition and wellness page posted at the link in the chat pod. The Nutrition and Wellness team are very excited to bring more webinars in the future. Our next one is Gut Microbiota Brain Access on Thursday, July 27th at 10 Central or 11 Eastern Time, and we hope you will join us. And now I'd like to turn it back to Coral.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And also just a heads up, Kristen or Robin, there is a question regarding RDN CPEUs in the chat pod. If you could respond to that, that'd be great. So I just wanted to thank Dr. Susan Johnson once again for sharing her wonderful expertise with us today. I know I personally learned just a whole slew of new information today and very much enjoyed the discussion and the engagement in the chat pod. So thank you again to all of our participants who also shared their experience, resources, and asked plenty of questions. It was such an enjoyable session today. If you would like to, we invite you to check out all of our upcoming and recorded webinars covering not only early intervention and nutrition and wellness topics, but a whole host of other areas. You can check those out at militaryfamilies.eextension.org/webinars. So we will leave this room open for a few more minutes in case you need to ask any quick follow-up questions or gather any links from the chat pod. Also know if you have any questions once we conclude today, you can email us at milfamln@gmail.com and we will ensure that your inquiry is responded to or gets to the correct person who can help you. So again, thanks for joining us today. We wish you a wonderful rest of your week and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks again, Dr. Johnson, and to the Nutrition and Wellness team for hosting today's session.